This lecture is going to be a really brief overview of the history of modern art, and I want to talk about, before I launch in, that the best way to understand art history in general is to study actual history, and you'll notice how art always reflects and tracks what's going on in the larger society. Another good thing to do is to study music, because always art and music are kind of one and the same. One expresses it one way, the other way, one through the eyes, one through the ears. Again, any classical music movement, such as Romanticism or Baroque or Rococo or Impressionism, Expressionism, early modernism, all of that has a aspect in both music and visual art. So I wanted to start by saying there's a certain or a large degree of synesthesia in all the arts. In other words, there's not really a hard line in how the different mediums are compartmentalized. I want to start by jumping right in, and we're going to start with Edward Manet, who I believe is sort of the real founder of modern art. Other people would probably argue Ingres or Goya or some people before Manet, but I want to start with Manet because I think that in my mind he was really the first artist or painter to deal totally with neutrality in his work. There's kind of a scientific detachment in his work. So from there I want to move quickly into the Impressionists. I think in some ways Manet was sort of the first Impressionist in that the Impressionists in general, including Manet, sort of stripped the world or their view of the world from direct emotion. There was kind of a detachment, a scientific detachment in their work. The most important, or the one I want to talk about the most in terms of the actual Impressionists, would be Claude Monet, who was, kind of a titan of that movement and continued to almost go beyond Impressionism into the late 1920s. So after Impressionism, we get into Post-Impressionism, and there's pretty much four key people to think about in terms of Post-Impressionism. The first would be Van Gogh, and the second would be Cézanne, the third would be Seurat, and the fourth would be Gauguin. We'll quickly go through all of those people. So Van Gogh is important because he sort of reintroduced emotion as taking whatever he's looking at and infusing it with his personal emotion, such as the German Expressionists and arguably even later Expressionist movements. And the second Post-Impressionist I want to get into would be Cézanne. Cézanne is incredibly important because he is kind of the first person, or one of the first people, to discover that nature could be reduced to the square, the sphere, and the plane. Everything could be reduced to basic geometric shapes. And because of that, his discoveries move right into Cubism, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the third Post-Impressionist to really that's important is Gauguin. Gauguin was kind of arguably the first sort of world artist. We all know we all know the term world music, but Gauguin sort of pioneered that in as much as he traveled outside of the sort of Western Orthodox world into what was then kind of an undiscovered treasure trove of information on other cultures which had alternative. In his case, Tahiti, which had for him a very utopian aspect. The next guy that's really important to think about is Georges Seurat. I want to add him because I think that he in some ways is the first digital artist. It's really interesting to think about him because in some ways when you think about digital technology, it really is breaking reality into tiny, tiny bits, and that's exactly what George Seurat did. He was a pointillist. He broke reality into tiny micro bits, and therefore is incredibly important in the larger arc of modern art. Now I want to jump from those four fundamental people into the next three kind of main things that happened next. And there was a sort of an explosion of upwards movement in the arts between 1900 and 1910. Those 10 years are really important. That was also when Einstein came up with the theory of relativity, and when Freud came up with the theory of dreams. So there was a lot of amazing stuff going on in society, a lot of technological breakthroughs in science and so forth. So the same thing was true with art. In those 10 years, an explosion of new things happened. The first thing I want to talk about, which I'll try to do it chronologically, was Fauvism. Fauvism is taking some of the language of Impressionism and infusing with heightened emotion, heightened color, in some cases decorative, in some cases much more emotive use of color. And then that was going on in France, and then the same thing was called Expressionism in Germany. The German art of that period was much sort of darker and probably arguably deeper than the French stuff, but the French stuff was maybe easier to look at. A lot of the German work was more psychoanalytic and dark and penetrating into kind of you could almost argue German Expressionism created Alfred Hitchcock and the noir movement in filmmaking. So anyway, that Fauvism and German Expressionism are one thing that happened, and I'd argue that came out of both Van Gogh mainly and Gauguin a little bit. The next huge thing going on was the beginnings of Cubism, and Picasso and Braque were the two main guys doing that, and they can't come directly out of, I'd say, Cézanne. And they also were heavily influenced, especially Picasso, by his daily trips to the Museum of Man in Paris, where he was introduced to black African art, which, you know, it was incredibly advanced in terms of the ideas in it. Other important cultures that infused with the introduction of trade and the beginnings of globalism, also other cultures that were highly important were everything from Northwest Coast Indian art to South Sea art, like the art of New Guinea, and even some people would argue Japanese print art, which, to go out retroactively actually influenced some of Van Gogh's work. So anyway, now we're getting out of Cubism, and another person I wanted to bring up, which kind of comes out of the absurdity of war and the horrors of World War I, were, I'd say, the Dada movement, which the main guy of that, when we think of that, was probably Marcel Duchamp, who actually is incredibly important to the history of later art. He was sort of the granddaddy of conceptual art. He's the first person to kind of come up with the idea that anything at all can be art. If I say it's art, if I put it into a gallery space, it can be thought of as art. So that now we're going to move in we're now getting into the 20s. In the 20s, there was the Dada movement and the early Surrealist movement, so the next thing I want to get into is basically Surrealism, which was really the last great, huge, important European movement. After Surrealism, basically the art world kind of moved to the New World, to mainly the United States, mainly New York City. So the Surrealists were usually, as a group, they were rather affluent educated, cynical, well-read kind of existentialists, and they were existential, and what I mean by that is that sort of life is a joke. You don't really take it seriously. Everything is allowed in terms of art, and so they were very interested in the subconscious and the irrational, in the things that don't make sense, and so they obviously surrealism influenced everything, including everything from Betty Boop cartoons to industrial design to filmmaking was a huge thing. Alfred Hitchcock actually hired Salvador Dali to do some of his work in one of his later 30s movies. So I'd say the three main important surrealists to think about are Salvador Dali, Rene Magritte, and arguably also Joan Miro. And they're three very different artists, but they all dealt to some extent with the irrational, with the subconscious, so forth. So now let's jump. We're moving pretty quickly here because we're running out of time to some extent, but we're going to go from because of World War II, because of the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy and so forth, a lot of the artists fled Europe, fled the European capitals, and many of them moved to New York City, and including some of the surrealists like Duchamp. Duchamp was a proto-surrealist. And so I left out a few other things I should have brought up, but it doesn't matter, but they're... Okay, well, where we left off was I think we were talking about the transition from surrealism to abstract expressionism, and the transition from the Western Art Center going from Europe, especially Paris, to New York City and the United States in general. So we're going to quickly go through modern art until the modern time as best I can. Of course, all this is subject to my opinion. You don't have to agree with me at all, of course. Anyway, so a few things I left out, a few very important artists that I left out that are going to come up soon, and related to surrealism. Loosely, Paul Klee is somebody that I should have included in the original as the fourth sort of important surrealist, although some people would argue whether he is or not. So anyway, what happened is because of the rise of fascism, the artists moved to New York, and there was sort of at the same time the dropping of the atomic bomb in 1945 and the end of World War II. There was sort of a global trauma. The first idea that we could destroy each other very quickly resulted in a very urgent sense of time and life in general. And abstract expressionism is the main exponent of that kind of line of thinking. Of course, in music, you got into Charlie Parker and abstract jazz or bebop, later Miles Davis, John Coltrane, etc. So anyway, Jackson Pollock, as de Kooning said, broke the ice. He's an incredibly important figure. He actively led up to the drip paintings, which started roughly in about 1947 and ran until about 1952, after the last few years of his life was kind of in an alcoholic haze. The other very important abstract expressionist, it's a loose term of course, really more accurately, he's an abstract impressionist or a color field painter coming out of Matisse. I didn't talk enough about Matisse, but Matisse is incredibly important for opening up a whole new language called color field painting. Mark Rothko is the first sort of abstract landscape. I'd almost call him a neo-romantic, abstract impressionism in some ways. Impressionism is fused with, massive amounts of cosmic emotion. he is incredibly important, one of the great colorists of all time, and one of the great, along with arguably Vermeer, Johannes Vermeer, Claude Monet, and Mark Rothko seem to be the greatest at recording different aspects of light and how color and light are mutually dependent on each other. The other great abstract expressionist worth talking about is obviously de Kooning, and then another one, the first female, I should have talked more about female artists, but it wasn't enough time, but Joan Mitchell is one of the great major figures in abstract expressionism, and she and de Kooning are similar to Pollock, and there's sort of an aggression to their work, but the difference is Joan Mitchell and de Kooning work with mainly with brushes, paint and brushes on canvas, whereas Pollock really was throwing the paint from a stick and got away entirely from the brush. After the sort of high seriousness of abstract expressionism, in the late 50s, you saw the emergence of sort of the very first parts of what would later turn into pop art. And I'd say the key transitional figures were three that I can think of off the cuff. Larry Rivers, lesser known than the other two, Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns. Those three people are incredibly important in terms of moving into hardcore pop art. Of course, the most famous by far pure pop artist would be Andy Warhol. There are other really good figures. James Rosenquist comes to mind, Roy Lichtenstein comes to mind. But one of probably the most important historical figure was Andy Warhol, who was incredibly important because his thing was stripping art of all seriousness, and sort of he himself said he was most interested in the surface aspects of things, the superficial aspects of things, literally superficial. So it was sort of rebellion against the serious, macho, drunken, kind of bacchanalian aspect of abstract expressionism. In the 60s in general, in pop art particularly, it was an aspect of a cool art was what was in. Quickly, Warhol later, after Warhol did his thing in the 60s and 70s, there was a period, in the 70s, the 70s was really the peak of minimalism and conceptual art. There was a lot of government support for the arts back then, so art wasn't so monetized, so it was more like theory-based, and also the aspect of land art was a big thing in the 1970s. And minimalism, people like Donald Judd, who, in my opinion, is probably the strongest of the minimalists. And then there were the color field painters like Ellsworth Kelly, worth talking about. And then, of course, the pendulum always moves back and forth. So by the 80s and 90s, you got into neo-expressionism, and God, did it go off already? Yeah. You got into neo-expressionism, and people like, frankly, much of the 80s and 90s work produced is terrible, not very good, and it was a time when the market caught finally where it's like the stock market and the art market sort of fused, and so art became, after the 80s and 90s and onwards, it became incredibly monetized, and it was less about the content of the actual work and more about how much money it could make, and artists became literally stars on the same level as rock stars or film stars or any other kind of star. So there's been a problem ever since, a really problematic thing in the visual arts since then. One of the worst aspects of it is the emergence of people like Jeff Koons, who actually don't even do their own work. At least Andy Warhol did do some stuff on all his work, although other people did most of it. So I wanted to talk about people that are really still relevant and important even now. Jeff Koons would be one, even if you don't like him. and argue that art that isn't even made by the artist is not art at all. The other people that I'd like to talk about are quickly is Damien Hirst. I think is pretty important. I relate quite a bit to his work. It's strongly about death and decay, and he kind of is in some arguably the same camp as Francis Bacon, another great artist that on another lecture would be worth more investigation. But Francis Bacon is an incredibly iconic and important artist, arguably fusing the energy of abstract expressionism and the angst of straight expressionism at the same time with a kind of a clinical coldness. Anyway, so the two other people worth bringing up are Gerhard Richter, who's still with us, still alive, and then George Baselitz. Both of those guys are German artists who are kind of, in some ways, we're sort of reviving the power and language of the first aspect of German expressionism. Emil Nol, Kirchner, Schmidt, Rotloff, people like that, the Bruch movement, and so forth. So I want to end it with that, and God knows where we're headed next. There's whole stuff, tons of stuff I left out. In fact, mostly I did leave stuff out, but there's video art, I didn't talk very much about conceptual art, I probably should have, but conceptual art really comes out of Duchamp, and the idea is more important than the product. So all these things are worth talking about, and for further investigation, thank you for listening. And again, this is mainly designed to be listened to, so hopefully you can look at some of these people I'm referencing on your iPad or laptop or phone, or anyway, I enjoyed it. I hope you did too, and maybe we'll see you again sometime soon. I wanted to say that a couple figures that I left out that I now regret, that should have been in the kind of post-impressionist arena that I should have brought up. One figure was Edvard Munch, incredibly important person in the influence, especially of expressionism. And many other movements were just completely left out. So we'll have to, if I do any future ones, I'll probably be more specific about what I talk about so that I won't leave so much out. This is just a complete very generalized overview of an incredibly vast subject. Thank you very much.